Hey everybody! So today I published a piece at The Spectator that details issues around the despicable prosecution, actually persecution, of Maria Butina, who I firmly believe is a political prisoner. And I share that belief with James Bamford, who I interviewed in podcast form on this channel and on my podcast a couple weeks ago. He is, bar none, the most authoritative journalist or any person on this case, except perhaps some people who were involved in the legal developments. So for him to acknowledge, along with me, that she's a political prisoner, I think should give credence to that statement. But anyway, in the piece, I go through some details that, to my knowledge, haven't been comprehensively laid out until today when I published this piece, which is that Mueller was so desperate at a late juncture to find some phantom colluder or to acquire some evidence that collusion took place that he sent a team to Maria Butina's jail cell on January 3rd of this year to interview her. Now, remember, at that point, Butina had been immersed in the criminal justice system for months and months, and she'd been investigated prior to her arrest in July of 2018. So at any point along the way, Mueller could have easily approached her for an interview. She was willing to give it. It's not as if she was hiding or refusing. Yet, at the very last minute, or near the last minute, in January, at almost the latest possible juncture in the 2-year special counsel investigation, Mueller decides to send a group of his staff to interview her in the Alexandria Federal Detention Center, where she had been housed since her arrest. And who else but Aaron Zelinsky was overseeing this interrogation. And Aaron Zelinsky, as you may know, was one of the most assertive Mueller prosecutors in questioning and charging numerous officials associated with the special counsel investigation and, on the subject of potential collusion. So for him to show up that day was kind of a big deal, and it probably raised some alarm because that was at a point where they had just got done tying up this absurd investigative loose end where they honed in on Jerome Corsi, the cognitively decrepit conspiracy theorist, and wanted to elicit a confession from him that he was a colluder of some kind. And it got so farcical that they ended up actually debating with him the nature of memory for hours upon hours. I mean, they subjected this 70-something-year-old man to, I forget the exact number, but something like 20 hours of questioning. All for naught. Corsi was never charged. I mean, Corsi's horrendous for many reasons, but not for having been the linchpin of any collusion conspiracy, obviously. So at that point, you got to think that the Mueller team was kind of flailing because they hadn't uncovered collusion, nothing even remotely resembling a criminal conspiracy. So they said, okay, I mean, even though we kind of ignored Butina up until now, let's give it a shot. So what did they do? They sent a team of prosecutors led by Zelinsky to her detention facility, and they asked her about a couple of things. One was they asked her about her dealings with this person, J.D. Gordon, who was a Trump national security aide over the course of the campaign, who later ended up getting interviewed by Mueller pretty extensively because I guess they thought he might have been the phantom colluder. And Butina had to explain her interactions with J.D. Gordon. And more or less what they amounted to was Butina attending, at Gordon's invitation, a Styx concert in October of 2016. So that was really the full extent of her supposed intelligence gathering activities with regard to J.D. Gordon. They went and rocked out together to the song Come Sail Away. Come sail away, come sail away. You know that one? So yeah, that was the big bombshell explosive evidence of collusion, which obviously amounted to nothing because Butina was not charged by Mueller. She was charged by D.C. prosecutors, so there's a distinction there. Although obviously there came to be some overlap between the two inquiries because Mueller's people interviewed her as well. She was interviewed for approximately an hour, and it really has to underscore how presumably panicked Mueller's team was at that point, because they had millions of dollars invested in this investigation. They had some of the most aggressive prosecutors in the entire country working full time on a collusion investigation, which is not typically the case for prosecutors. Often they have all kinds of stuff going on in their schedules, and they can't just focus full time on one thing. How many search warrants was it? Something like 500. All these, intelligence analysts, full subpoena power, the backing of the U.S. Treasury with limited financial resources, and they came up with nothing. Absurdly, they asked Butina about the issue of the Republican platform in 2016, which people have been screeching about forever as somehow proof that Putin was directing Trump to direct his underlings at the Republican convention to modify the platform so the language on Ukraine was softened. Of course, it turned out to be a total fiction. The platform wasn't meaningfully less hawkish on Ukraine, and it wasn't even done at the behest of Trump, much less Putin. And the platform is meaningless anyway. It's not binding on anything. Most of the time, no one even cares about their party platform because it doesn't actually have any real-world implications for the most part. So they asked her what she knew about that, which is obviously nothing. And then, most bizarrely, they asked her about a New York Times story dated December 3rd, 2017, which reported that Butina's boyfriend, Paul Erickson, who was this older man, and everybody kind of disgracefully assumed that she must have been in some kind of transactional honeypot relationship with him, even though he was her long-term boyfriend and she's an adult and can make whatever romantic decisions she wants. And the petty moralizing on that was really just disgusting. But anyway, the New York Times article that the Mueller's team wanted to ask her about was a report that the boyfriend, Paul Erickson, had sent an email to an official in the Trump campaign, Rick Dearborn, in which Erickson suggested that Putin wanted to meet with Trump and Erickson could somehow set this up. And what Butina said was, this was total BS. It was all puffery on Erickson's part. Clearly, he was making reference to the fact that Butina could somehow set up a meeting with Trump, which was ridiculous. Butina had no formal connections at all with the Russian government. Her handler was this one Russian official, Torshin, who was the equivalent of somebody on the Federal Reserve in Russia. And even him, she didn't have a formal relationship with. They just had kind of a grandfatherly, friendly relationship. She never worked for him. She never took direction from him. Everything she did in the United States was at her own direction because she was an ambitious graduate student at American University with near perfect grades, by the way, who wanted to work in international policy. And she thought that her kind of like private diplomatic initiatives could not only help to, in a marginal way, reduce tensions with Russia, a nuclear armed power. Wow, how offensive is that? But also, establish contacts for her that she could later use to get some kind of job at a think tank or what have you. I mean, it's called networking. It's a little bit amoral at times, and it can be irritating and even corrupt, but it's as normal as breathing air in Washington, D.C. I mean, you're considered abnormal if you don't do it. And that's what she was doing. But as far as the meeting that Erickson suggested he could set up, there was no chance of that happening at all. But regardless, Mueller, or his team, decided to ask Butina about the New York Times article, and then she clarified to them that it was nonsense. But if you think about it, what does it say that the Mueller's team at that late juncture of the special counsel investigation was asking her questions not having to do with material that they had furnished as a result of their intensive investigation? They were asking her about stuff in the New York Times. I mean, I thought these guys were the most aggressive and skilled prosecutors on earth. And yet they're relying on media reports to conduct interviews with, persons of interest. It's kind of pathetic. And it also should raise some red flags if you're being interviewed in that circumstance, because the Mueller's team showed that they were perfectly willing to catch people on technicalities about dates, about trivial details that they don't recollect perfectly, and then, have them charged criminally for that and sent to prison, which is what happened to George Papadopoulos, whose crime, essentially, was misstating a date from March 2016 by about, 8 or 9 days. So Butina had good reason to fear that if she misstated something, even something that seemed relatively inconsequential, they could have, charged her on it. But, ultimately, Butina wasn't mentioned anywhere at all in the Mueller report, which, again, heightens the absurdity of all this, because at her sentencing hearing on April 26th, was it? Let me just double check that, because I know I need to be utterly perfect for all you people in terms of every little date. Maybe I'll get charged if I misstate the date. Just give me 1 second. It doesn't honestly matter all that much. Okay, whatever. Her sentencing date was in late April, and the judge at the time, who was presiding, name is Tanya Chutkan, D.C. Circuit Court judge, remarked that, it was April 26th. See? I'm not good. Remarked that the punishment meted out to Butina was justified, in part because Butina was operating in the United States doing this non-covert, non-espionage, perfectly public, entirely public-facing activity. All that she was doing at the same time as, according to Chutkan, the Russian government was acting to interfere and affect the United States political and electoral process. Now, hold on. Okay, let's assume that interference took place as alleged. It had zero to do with Butina. She had no involvement in Facebook memes or Twitter trolls or hacked emails or anything like that. So to somehow conflate her with this wider, phenomenon of Russian interference was totally groundless. And to then cite it as justification for why her 18-month prison sentence was warranted is utterly specious and offensive, and Tanya Chutkan should be ashamed of herself. In fact, I think there are grounds to appeal now on Butina's part, given the judge's totally irresponsible statement. Of course, there were all these other kinds of smears that were hurled at Butina that utterly fell apart. Tim Dickinson of Rolling Stone, who's been one of the worst journalistic offenders on this story and has disgraced himself and should apologize. And I mentioned him by name in the piece. And I've called him out on Twitter, and I'll probably do that again today because he just makes me that angry. He did this sleazy story in April 2018 that I actually talked about with James Bamford, who also condemned it, raising this completely unsupported theory that Butina somehow infiltrated the NRA so Russian money could be funneled through the NRA and fund Trump's campaign. Absurd. Didn't happen. Prosecutors who threw Butina in jail never even alleged this. And yet you had that flurry of idiotic stories, slanderous stories, really, about Butina infiltrating this massive, advocacy organization when all she really did was show up in events. I mean, that's some infiltration. And she would document it on social media. Again, nothing she did was ever spy related. A spy doesn't go to public events, broadcast that she's there, write columns outlining her views, which she did, and basically take no steps to hide any of her activity. So this idea that there was this popular conception that she was a spy is phenomenally stupid. The only part of it that they got right was that, yes, Butina was interested in gun rights because she grew up in rural Siberia. And just like in the U.S., rural people in Russia tend to be a little more interested in guns than people who live in the city. Shocking, right? And that was the whole reason why she came into contact with this guy, Torshin, because he was also somewhat of an idiosyncratic character by Russian standards, and he had an interest in gun rights as well. And she had this little gun rights organization in Russia. Now, people say that makes her a right-winger. I don't even think that's true because in the context of Russia, supporting gun rights is like supporting liberalization because Putin is not in favor of gun rights. I mean, he's taken steps to quash that. So it's not like a straightforwardly right-wing thing, and people kind of apply the parochial American political context to stuff that goes on around the world where it doesn't fit neatly into the same partisan paradigm as it would, here. Although, I mean, I think there are a lot of, rural people who aren't even conservatives who also have guns here. So it's kind of not even applicable here in a way, but at least in terms of kind of the oversimplified public understanding, Butina was not really a right-winger. She was just in favor of gun rights. And so the people that tend to be in favor of gun rights in the U.S. are conservatives. So she went to all kinds of conservative gatherings. Big deal. And they said that she was a spy, right? She would go to these conservative gatherings and take photos with presidential candidates. Don't spies generally try to conceal their behavior? They wouldn't be taking photos with these people like Rick Santorum, Scott Walker. And that's the worst possible thing you could do as a spy. But that didn't stop even recently when Butina, she was in the Alexandria Federal Detention Facility for basically the duration of her incarceration. And then that just within the past week or so, maybe a little more than a week, they all of a sudden hauled her off to this county jail in Oklahoma, far away from her lawyers, where she's now staying. And, the county, it's weird. If somebody's a national security threat in the way that Butina was portrayed, you're going to send her to some county jail in Oklahoma, basically in the middle of nowhere. No offense to Oklahomans. It makes no sense. Apparently, this county jail is also used as a federal transfer facility of some kind. But if she was engaging in these kind of surreptitious efforts at the behest of the Russian government to nefariously influence American politics, you're not going to put that person in a county jail somewhere in Oklahoma. You're going to put them in a very secure facility, right, with the other people who committed espionage. But they didn't do it. It makes no sense. Nothing about this case stands up to scrutiny. And it's really despicable what they've done to her. She is a political prisoner. Mary Louise Kelly of NPR, who interviewed her recently and had the gall to ask Maria Butina, "Are you a spy?" She should be ashamed of herself, and I've said so publicly, and I'll continue to say so because, again, this makes me so angry. And, coincidentally or not, after that interview aired on NPR, they hauled her off to Oklahoma. So was it retaliation? May have been, because they've definitely subjected her to extremely punitive measures while incarcerated in the past. She was in solitary confinement for no good reason for months. She was in solitary confinement when they coerced a guilty plea out of her. And, if you're in solitary confinement, even if you don't think you did the crime, it's pretty damn common to nonetheless admit it, or at least a version of the charges against you, because you're under duress. And she was under duress. Anybody in solitary confinement is under duress, and it's shocking how little liberals and progressives seem to care about that. Terribly awful tactic being used against her. And what she charged was, what she admitted guilt to, was in essence a registration violation. Now, it wasn't FARA. She wasn't charged under FARA, which is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is what Paul Manafort got charged with, etc. She was actually charged under a separate statute, which had to do with agents of foreign governments operating in the U.S. Because nothing that Butina did was unto itself illegal, absent this registration issue. So literally what she could have done to theoretically avoid these charges was, once she was in the U.S., she could have done something as simple as sent an email to the Attorney General's office notifying them of her presence. And theoretically, she could have evaded all charges, but practically probably not, because they wanted to charge her on anything. They wanted to find something to charge her with. So the prosecutors in D.C., who were also disgraced themselves, dramatically expanded the range of applicable conduct under this particular statute so that they could charge Butina. If you look at others who have been charged under the same statute, and I have the exact statute in the piece, these tend to be people who were obviously engaged in illicit espionage-related activity. So one person charged in 2008 was this Chinese national who was in the U.S. lawfully and was alleged to have unlawfully acquired classified national security material and sent it to some Chinese official. Butina didn't do anything remotely like that. She never had access to classified material. She wasn't engaging in espionage. She was doing everything in public because she wanted to be an advocate. She was a politically active graduate student. She wasn't a lobbyist. That's why they couldn't charge her under FARA. She wasn't a business person. She was, an idealistic young person. Whether you agree with what she was doing or not, that's just who she was. Yet they've ruined her life. She's in all likelihood going to be deported back to Russia after this. And it's really a shame. I mean, it's shameful how she's been treated. And I think it's equally shameful how few journalists care about it. I mean, shame on them. It shouldn't just be me, James Banford, and a handful of others talking about this egregious abuse of power, of governmental power, to railroad somebody who, in essence, did nothing wrong. All her conduct would have been seen as utterly normal under any other political circumstances. It's only because of this wider Russian interference narrative that any attention was brought to her at all. That's why she didn't register with the Attorney General. It didn't even occur to her that what she was doing would require registration. She wasn't an agent of the Russian government. She had no formal relationship with the Russian government. Just because she had a friendship with some Russian official doesn't mean that she's getting direction from the Russian GRU or something to engage in what she engaged in. And on top of that, guess what could happen now? Well, lots of people engage in activity that could be regarded as doing stuff at the behest of a foreign government in Washington, D.C. If you want to have some laughs, try to go tally up how many people are acting in such a capacity in Washington, D.C. at the behest of, I don't know, Israel, Saudi Arabia, even the United Kingdom. Those same people now, if there's some political incentive, could theoretically be charged under the same statute, even though nothing that they did could have been remotely construed as criminal. It's only because there's this, depraved political motivation underlying it. And further, Americans in foreign capitals, not just Russia, could be charged on similarly spurious grounds in a way to retaliate. So now Americans have to watch their backs even more in foreign capitals, because innocuous conduct can now be wildly twisted into acting as an agent of the American government. So that's now the precedent that we have to deal with. Nobody seems to care. In fact, they cheer and celebrate at the horrors with which Butina has been subjected. And I'm disgusted about it. I'm disgusted with the media. I'm disgusted with the politicians who either tout this prosecution or ignore it. And that goes for Democrats and Republicans. I don't see many Republicans saying much about it either. The federal law enforcement apparatus has utterly destroyed its credibility, which is fine with me because I didn't think they had much credibility to begin with, but it's sunk even further into the disgusting sludge-filled gutter. And everybody's really to blame in a way because she's a political prisoner and we all have responsibility for how our government operates. So that's about it. Again, I have the piece published today, so I'll link to it, of course, and I will talk to you later.